Good afternoon, everyone, and everyone on Zoom. I know we can't see you, but welcome. Welcome all of you to this public lecture on epistemic alterity and freedom. So let me first quickly introduce myself. I am the NRF Saatchi Chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa, Iscia. The chair is kind of situated in the Humanities faculty at Nelson Mandela University. And it brings together a whole network of researchers, postdoctoral fellows, and postgraduate students, all trying to consider what humanities disciplines, especially philosophy and the visual arts, can tell us about all of the disparate and different aspects of the complex kind of interrelationship between identities and social cohesion. So a very big umbrella project that brings together a whole lot of different scholars. So today we are very happy to host, I was going to say Dr. Siseko Kumalo, but I am now allowed to say Professor, Professor Kumalo. Recently from the University of Fort Hare, but I believe he has just accepted an associate professorship at the University of Johannesburg. So congratulations are certainly in order in that respect. Professor Kumalo is a political theorist. His work examines social ontology, focusing on Blackness and Indigeneity in South Africa. His doctorate analysed belonging and national identity. So you can see where he shares a kind of a deep interest with the Iscia chair. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Decolonising, and Disciplines. And he received a Harvard South Africa Fellowship Program in 2022, which he spent developing the Black Archive visual podcast. And other innovative research, he says, at Harvard. So that's very exciting to be in that space. And bring whatever you create in that space back here and bring whatever you have here over to Harvard. It's very exciting, yes. And his research has garnered international attention, featuring in platforms like the United Nations Pre-Summit for the Future in New York in 2024. That's quite recent. I would also like to introduce you to Professor Vulindlela Nyoni. Prof. Nyoni will act as a respondent to Dr. Professor Kumalo's lecture on epistemic alterity and freedom. Prof. Nyoni is the head of Nelson Mandela's Department of Visual Arts, and he's an artist trained primarily in printmaking. Prof. Nyoni's doctorate, entitled Diaspora in Dialogue, is deeply embedded in this practice of epistemic alterity and the question of freedom. In his study, he brings together the voices of 3 different artists living between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and through art as a different way of knowledge production, that's what is meant by epistemic alterity, or one of the things it means. He arrives at these deep insights about migration, freedom of movement, being free, and being free to be. So there's a deep connection between what Prof. Nyoni does in art making as the practice of epistemic alterity and what Prof. Kumalo will be talking about here in the public lecture. So with that, I'm not going to say any more. I welcome both of you, and I am very much looking forward to an interesting discussion. So, Prof. Kumalo, the floor is yours.
It's a strange thing, Professor Hurst. No, you know, I always refer to Andrea as Andrea. Now that we're so formal, I'm trying to find her last name in my mind. I'm like, it's Hurst. It's a strange thing, this title change, right? It's recent, it's new, it's exciting. Yeah. So it's a bit of a, when you said it, I sat there and I thought, everybody's been Dr. Kumalo, Dr. Kumalo. And there's always this kind of joke of the football player, right? So I guess that falls away now, fortunately. Yeah. Firstly, let me just thank the chair for inviting me to give this lecture. And maybe let me also contextualize this particular series. So this is a set of lectures that I have given across institutions across the country. I started out at the University of Pretoria last year. I think it was around about June or July. And then I went over to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I find myself at Nelson Mandela today. I was just saying to my good colleague, Prof. Nyoni, that I don't know what to do with them, whether they should become standalone lectures or whether they should actually become a book. But the most interesting one, and I hope today is going to be even more interesting, but the most interesting one is the recent one that I gave, which was that, are we going to adjust this thing? Brilliant. Can't you hear me? Okay, now you can hear me better, I believe. I see. Perfect, perfect. The UKZN lecture was a fascinating one for me because of, and it still fascinates me as I continue to develop it, because I was thinking about constitutional crises and how Blackness shows up as a political agent in the context of South Africa. And I was looking at the sort of problem that arose when the Constitutional Court remanded the former president into custody, or gave the order that the former president be remanded into custody. I'm not interested in the violence. I've never been interested in questions of violence. I was far more interested in the complexity that that particular problem gave us. And two individuals diagnosed this particular problem: the dissenting judgment penned by Justice Theron, and Mqhayi, the then leader of Ibu Zulu, who decides to take Ibu Zulu to Nkandla when this judgment is handed down. And both of them sort of take an Arendtian analysis, which is to say, which makes a distinction between, power and authority, and when authority wanes, it enforces itself through power, indicating that, in fact, actually authority has failed. So both of them kind of perceive this authority vacuum. This is Justice Theron and Mqhayi. And we see the fact that they see it in the dissenting judgment and in Mqhayi's declaration that he's taking Ibu Zulu to Nkandla, even against the cautionary remarks of the then Zulu Prime Minister, Umntwana Ubuthelezi. May he rest in peace. So I continue, I'm sort of giving this background because I want to think about those kind of issues, even as I'm sort of dealing with this notion of epistemic alterity and the ontology of Ubuqaba as a premise for freedom. And to give this background, I think I give it on the back of the fact that Mqhayi identifies as Gqoba, right? All the way to his death. He says, Angifundile, and in my not being educated, there's something though that is fascinating that he is still able to do, in the sense that he causes an incredible constitutional crisis for our country, which is fascinating and exciting for me as a political theorist. I'm not an anti-constitutionalist. Please do not take that away as the sort of takeaway from these sort of prefacing remarks. I think the fascination and the excitement for me comes in the fact that in the liberal framework of the South African Constitution, we have these kind of permutations that always suggest a need to sort of speak back to the liberal framework of our country. And I say that if we do not understand the contribution maybe, or the framework of Ubuqaba and what it can do for our democracy, we really run the risk, a very dangerous risk, I think, of collapsing the entire democratic project in this country. And more often than not, Ubuqaba is dismissed, and this is a very historical point. It is dismissed as uneducated, as lacking, as, there are all of these. In fact, the dismissal of Ubuqaba in its written format comes up in 1885 at Lovedale, when William Wellington Gqoba addresses the Lovedale Literary Society on the natives' customs, their beliefs, their laws, and he's very pejorative towards the natives, right? You fast forward from 1885 to 2024, or 2024, Jacob Zuma says, I'm leaving the ANC, not leaving the ANC, but he says, I'm founding Umkhonto weSizwe Party. And what response do we get from His Excellency, former President Thabo Mbeki? He says, it is useful that certain elements are leaving the ANC, right? So this continued conversation happens over centuries of those who see themselves as the gentleman's club of letters and those that are sort of to be regarded outside of this culture of letters in the South African political landscape, amaqaba. And it's a beautiful contestation because in South Africa, what it then does in 2024, in the election in 2024, is that it really invites a major problem for the ANC, because the Umkhonto weSizwe Party shows up onto the scene and gets a very nice 15% and becomes the official opposition in the country, etc. This is the reason why I say that if we do not pay attention to Ubuqaba ontology in the framework of the political project that is South Africa, it's going to creep up on us, and then we're going to say, oh, but we never thought about it. We had never seen it coming. It's going to come and it's going to cause a problem for us in the democratic project that is South Africa. And at the moment, I'm neither in favor or against how it shows up in the political domain. I want us to understand it. What does it mean? Now, all of this is to say that the project of Ubuqaba is, and our derision toward it, and I actually did a piece on this a couple of weeks ago. I lied, it wasn't weeks ago, it was a couple of moons ago. I did a piece on it in Theoria, whereby I think about the question of amaqaba namaqoboga working through colonial derision of Black ontology, right? And I'm working through it using the scholarship and ideas of Black intellectuals themselves, right? Who themselves are pejorative of Ubuqaba ontology. And again, the debates are very extensive. Go back to John Dengo Jabavu and how he positions himself in relation to the political project of South Africa, the colonial and conquest project of South Africa, and the support, for example, of the 1913 Land Act that he gives. And his own son, DDT Jabavu, only speaks out and against his father post the death of Ujon Dengo Jabavu himself, to say maybe this is a problem, the support that we have lent to the dispossession of the native in our country, right? So it's a very historical debate. And again, I say if we don't pay attention to it, we might find ourselves in a very curious position where many were saying, and I really found this rather upsetting, and in fact rather pedestrian, let me rather put it like that. It was pedestrian, where we had very curious diagnoses, supposedly political commentary in our country, where people said, oh, the rise of MK party is ethno-nationalist politics. And I thought to myself, and these are people who claim that they are very well educated and yet they're very anti-intellectual. They claim to be very educated public intellectuals. And they sit on national news feeds and they say, oh, MK party is an ethno-nationalist project. And I think, what a vapid analysis. But in any case, let's not speak to the vapidity of anti-intellectuals in this country who style themselves as intellectuals. But But that's the danger that we allow ourselves to get into if we don't actually confront the historicity of these questions. Now, I say this. I then suggest that the project of being pejorative toward Ubuqaba, even in the post-apartheid framework of our country, actually happens in the university space. And my own discipline is very, very responsible precisely for this project, that is philosophy. And so what I want to think about here are the epistemic practices that are constitutive of the discipline to give us this kind of derisive attitude towards Ubuqaba, and to then think about what Ubuqaba means for the project of political freedom in our country, specifically as it concerns the majority, right? Yeah, so I'm going to speak to the paper. I'm going to interact with the paper. I recall having said that I'm going to only take 30 minutes for this project, but I think I've already spent 10 minutes, so I should probably get on with the project, right? So I'm dealing with the epistemic practices then of the institutional arrangements of philosophy. And here I want to surface those institutional arrangements' sociality, right? Again, when I'm thinking about this particular project of how this all really happens, I see its physical manifestation in the political domain as the very comment that comes from, as I say, His Excellency, former President Mbeki, suggesting that Jacob Zuma's sort of move out of the ANC is a useful one because he is not part and parcel of the gentleman's club, the man of letters. And he doesn't necessarily frame it in that particular logic or in that language, but if we understand the history of the African National Congress, so Jacob Zuma is a really curious cat who's always sort of a thorn on the side of the ANC because he does not conform to the culture of letters and how the culture of letters has defined the formation of the ANC and its subsequent sort of manifestation in terms of the liberation politics of South Africa. Now, the aim in highlighting the sociality is to detail the social constituent elements of the discipline, and by virtue of having surfaced the social constituent elements, revealing how these elements directly impact on the epistemic practices of those who are defined as knowers and those who are excluded from the category of legitimate knowers. Again, I want to go back to Mqhayi and Justice Theron, right? So both of them come to the same conclusion. Mqhayi understands that there's an authority vacuum, which is why he says, I'm taking ibutho lika Zulu to Nkandla. And Justice Theron herself diagnoses that the necessity to have to implore, to have to use or appeal to the SACP and South African National Defence Force in remanding the former president into custody, that in itself showcases a fundamental problem in terms of the authority of the Constitutional Court. And if we are not aware of this fundamental problem, we open up the Constitutional Court to a number of challenges. And remember, Jacob Zuma is a cat who's always saying, you know, he plays this ball game of appellate courts, appellate courts, appellate courts. And what happens is that he's now at the highest court of the land, which gives him a decision that he doesn't like, and he has no other appellate court. The Constitution bakes in a contradiction by acknowledging tribal authority in this country, right? And this contradiction that's baked in is baked in even in the form of the constitution of what do they call the House of Traditional Leadership, right? Which the president subjects himself to questions to time and again. And so there's a real sense of legitimacy in tribal authority being recognized by the constitutional framework of our country. And so both Mqhayi and Nxamalala notice this. So if we don't have an appellate court beyond the constitutional court, what else is in the constitution that we can actually leverage? And they leverage the fact of their tribal authority. And not in, because remember, the time when Mqhayi says, I'm going to Nkandla, there's no element of violence. He's not saying, screw the state. He's not saying, set fire to the state. None of that has happened It's the people who decide to use the authority vacuum as a way of starting an insurgency in KZN and Gauteng. Umgilija is just saying, that's what he says. It's a beautiful thing. Really, it is an absolutely beautiful thing if we're thinking about political theory as it generates from our own context. It's an amazing thing because it's a contradiction. And what has then also happened is that the acting Deputy Chief Justice, Justice Kampepe at the time, has already enlisted the Minister of Police as well as the Defense Forces to say, you have to action this court order. So it's a storm of beautiful disaster for the constitutional framework of South Africa, and an opportunity that I think many legal and jurisprudential scholars are missing by not necessarily detailing and unpacking it. And then, of course, it becomes our duty as philosophers to do that kind of work. So in this framework, Umgilija is the not knowing being, right? The illegitimate knower. And Theron is the sort of legitimate knower. And both of them sort of converge on one particular conclusion, that the authority of the constitutional court is actually being challenged and can be challenged quite radically. Now, by sociality, I mean individuals forming a social cooperative which institutes permissible behavior and actions while excluding actions which fall outside the predefined social codes, right? So in the framework of, I'm a good law-abiding citizen, Zuma says, okay, fine. The court has said I must go into custody, I'm going to go into custody without necessarily doing this kind of appealing type of thing. But because his nature has always been one that resists a liberal framework in general, he doesn't necessarily say, I'm not going to prison, and because I'm not going to prison, I'm going to appeal to tribal authority. But he leverages tribal authority to the extent that from 2021 to 2023, we then have the emergence of Umkhonto weSizwe, which becomes a real challenge to. And if you see, there's a video that goes around where Uzuma is in his kraal, and Umgilija, I believe, is also there. Abesathi Umgilija, nakho ke siyakunika umkhonto baba. Right? And so there's a whole conversation happening. Again, I'm not interested in the violence, right? The public violence, public disorder, that's a sociological question of no interest to me. It is interesting and useful to others who might indeed study it, but it is of no use to me. So he steps outside of this, I should actually take what the court is saying and hand myself over. He steps outside of those codes. I use then the concept of sociality in the context of decolonial philosophy, which as argued, or which as I will rather show radically, charges the question posed by pure philosophy through the work of political philosophers. Right? So if we take seriously the work that the decolonial philosopher does, we really sort of sit with a supercharged, again, I appeal to Hannah Arendt here, where Hannah Arendt sort of suggests that, the real philosophical work is thinking through political questions, right? And it's a very, very charged space. In the act of locating decoloniality in political philosophy, the result is a doubly charged tension. On the first on the front of decoloniality, speaking from an historically devalued place of political philosophy, which subsequently interrogates pure philosophy and the significance of thought. This interrogation is radicalized by decoloniality, which demands that pure philosophy disabuse itself of endless abstraction and furthermore reveal its loci of enunciation. In the second aspect of the tension that arises out of decoloniality being situated in the political philosophy tradition, the charge that pure philosophy ought to reveal its loci of enunciation centers the political significance of thought. Right? Centering the political significance of thought suggests that the loci of enunciation is not only revealed, but further to the revelation questions the epistemic practices of the discipline, ultimately highlighting the concept of sociality. So what the discipline always tries to do is that we try to say, no, we don't deal with political questions, we just deal with thought. And yet we don't sort of think and interrogate in our sort of epistemic practices how in doing so we're actually fashioning how the world out there actually functions, right? So part of what happens more often than not is that many of us tend to be sort of quote unquote silently acquiescing liberals. And in so doing, we don't sort of often think about what does that mean for the social conditions of our reality. Remember again, colleagues, I'm going to remind us that what I'm interested in is what does it mean for us to actually look at and interrogate what Ubuqaba means for the political project of South Africa, right? So when we're saying that we are sort of silently acquiescing liberals, and I often say this to my students, I'm currently concluding a course at second year level that speaks to the question of liberalism in South Africa, actually. And I say to my students, you know, when you ask or when you confront yourself or when you confront the question of Ubuqaba, think about one simple thing and you critique it. Are you legitimately critiquing it using its internal grid? Or are you, for example, you know what, and we really see the framework of Ubuqaba in the manifesto of the African, of Mkhonto weSizwe, right? We really see it. This idea of prioritizing tribal authority or traditional authority, whichever you might wish to put as the more politically correct one, and all of the kind of attendant aspects that come out there, right? And people are always saying, no, but it's backward, it's retarded, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. And the question really is, are we making that judgment on the basis of indeed its retardation and backwardness, or are we making that suggestion because we are so used to a liberal framework that has a particular criteria of how the political realm ought to be organized? And I think it's the latter. We're often critiquing Ubuqaba from this perspective of, but we enjoy these and these and these other rights. And I'm not going to lie. It sometimes scares me the way that the MK party sort of frames itself, because some folks know this, but I'm a gay man, right? And so what they say about us LGBTQ folk is that we ought to be sort of taken off into a very curious place and. So it's not as that I'm wholesalely invested in this thing, but I'm trying to do philosophical work of appraising what they're doing using sort of a frame of reference, a system of analysis that is inherent to that particular system of understanding and being, right? I don't want to say, because I'm a gay man, I should be critical of this thing, because liberalism secures my rights as a gay man. I think that would be a cop-out. Which is what many of us philosophers tend to do. We tend to cop out. But in any case, that is not the point that I'm making. The sociality of epistemic practices then focuses in on Fricke's main argument, which lies in tracing epistemic practices as they are of necessity played out by subjects that are socially situated, right? So this is what I'm saying, there's this relationship here between the discipline, its inherent logics, and how the discipline subsequently fashions and creates a reality that exists outside of us. Simply put, my aim lies in a detailed understanding of how the subjects that are socially situated constitute the institutional disciplinary boundaries of pure philosophy, thus enlivening the ethical dimension of epistemic practices that Fricke suggests. And I've got to then sort of say something here for a quick second. Insofar as I'm interested in Fricke, I'm also kind of critical of Fricke, because some of the arguments that Fricke is making, we have found them in the scholarship of the likes of S.E.K, Mqhayi, for example, as early as his release of Ityala Mawele, right, which comes out, I think, initially in 1910, and it becomes refined, and he edits it, and he sort of expands it, and then he gives us Ityala Mawele in the version that we know it, I believe, by 1914. So the questions that he asks, by the way, in the preface to the book are questions of serious epistemic nature, which we do not consider because it is written in isiXhosa, right? So again, do you see what happens there? Because a particular question is framed in a particular lexicon, is situated in a particular locale, it becomes an anthropological question as opposed to a philosophical question. And yet when Fricke says it in English in 2006, it's a deeply and profoundly philosophical question. So I'm critical, colleagues. I like Fricke a lot, but I'm critical of the way in which these and think about how the question of epistemic justice has so profoundly developed in the South African context, using Fricke's analysis in our department, students thinking about these questions. And none of our students are actually even aware that there was such a cat known as S.E.K. Mqhayi, who himself thought about the questions and the implications of the political condition and its impact on the knowledge of our country. So I should then first clarify what it is that I mean by sociality, as highlighting and nuancing the task which Fricke sets out to deal with in her treatise on epistemic justice. Now, Fricke describes her task as bringing to light certain ethical aspects of two epistemic practices, the first being conveying knowledge to others by telling, and the second aspect being making sense of our own social experiences. The ethical dimensions in Fricke's project arise from the operation of social power in epistemic interactions which expose a politics of epistemic practice, right? Let me give you an example of what the hell I'm talking about here before I lose you. In the dissenting judgment, Theron says, if we get the police and the SANDF to enforce this court order, the authority of the court has waned. Gilija sees exactly the same problem and says, but he gets dismissed as sort of inspiring violence. Vele Ubuqaba, he's an uneducated, illiberal fool. In fact, the traditional prime minister at the time, Ushenge, accuses him of trying to destabilize the state. But he's making the exact observation that Justice Theron has made in her dissenting judgment. And he has not read the dissenting judgment by the time that he makes this call to go to Nkandla. He hasn't. But because of where he is speaking from, we dismiss him. And if anything, we burden him when violence breaks out in KZN and in Gauteng as the source of that violence. And if we were to do that, then we would also have to sort of lay the buck at Justice Theron's doorstep as well, who also, by the way, makes the same assessment. And of course, I'm not saying that it was a useful thing, the violence. I think that is opportunism. But the opportunism comes from this authority vacuum. In that moment in this country, really democracy is tits up, if we can call it that. Apologies for my French. But really it is. It's really cool stuff in that moment because we are a constitutional democracy. The constitutional court's authority has waned. And everybody who is spectating into this thing is seeing precisely that. And then to reduce the vacuum of authority to ethno-nationalism, do you understand why I say it's vapid? It's really vapid. And these are people who take themselves very seriously. And they say we are political commentators. Sahat. But asikho lapho. So this is what I'm saying. When Fricke is talking about this, when she's talking about conveying knowledge by telling and the significance of that, the ethical dimension in Fricke's project arises from the operation of social power in epistemic interactions which expose the politics of epistemic practice. This is what I'm talking about. There are certain individuals who are given more authority than others when they're making particular claims about the world. The concept of a politics of epistemic practice highlights two aspects, I think, of my argument. The first, the political significance of thought, which of course is discussed in Hannah Arendt's work. And secondly, it interrogates the point zero perspectives of Eurocentric philosophy or philosophies. On the first implication, which is the political perspectives of Eurocentric, or on the first, which is the political significance of thought rather, Fricke suggests that confronting oneself or confining oneself to a highly abstracted conception of human subjects restricts the sort of philosophical questions and insight one can come up with, right? So she's saying, basically, it's useful, yes, to sort of think very abstractly, but it might also be important to think about how that abstract thought sort of plays itself out really in human interactions on a daily basis, which is what I'm trying to think through. So you cannot accuse me of being, quote unquote, a historian or an anthropologist. I'm actually a philosopher, according to Fricker. The limitation highlighted by Fricker re-invokes the suspicion which other disciplines had of philosophy in the 19th century, as suggested by Mudimbe's Gulbenkian report on the social sciences. So that comes out, I think, when was it? It was in 1995, that short report that he does, the Gulbenkian report, which culminated in the discipline being viewed as a substitute. So that suspicion that other disciplines had of the discipline of philosophy culminates in philosophy being viewed as a substitute of theology, which makes a priori claims which cannot be validated. As a response to this first limitation, or to this limitation, Fricker alternatively puts it that we ought to start from the socially situated conception, which allows us to trace some of the interdependencies of power, reason, and epistemic authority, right? So as a way of attempting to sort of alleviate the tensions that arise out of our suspicion of philosophy, she says that, and I'll read it again, she says that we have to start at the socially situated conception in order to trace the interdependencies of power, reason, and epistemic authority. Within this framework of understanding epistemic justice, the concept of sociality, which is defined as individuals forming social cooperatives that sanction permissible action, highlights the ethical dimension of our epistemic practices, both at the individual level as well as from the perspective of disciplinary knowledge and canon formation, which will lead to an analysis that is that details the ethical dimensions of Fricker's project. In sum, the aim here is to detail how our epistemic conduct might become at once more rational and more just, right? And why are we looking for epistemic conduct? I see, I've got 10 more minutes to wrap up. Yeah, I've got 10 more minutes to wrap up. This is really getting exciting. But why are we interested in our epistemic conduct being more rational and more just? It's because, as I say, if we don't take account of Ubuqaba ontology, it's going to show up in the political domain. It has already showed up in the political domain in ways that we cannot make sense of. And because we cannot make sense of the ways in which it shows up, we then reduce it to ethno-nationalism. And you should have seen how people post-elections were like, yes, MK is ethno-nationalist, MK is ethno-nationalist, MK is ethno-nationalist. They've just recently released their constitution. And I'm really intrigued if we will still say they are ethno-nationalist. I don't think they are. I think, in fact, and I'm not a supporter of the MK party, I'm apolitical in the political domain of this country. I really am. I try to be, I think. No, I am. I heard a chuckle in the room. I try to be. I know I try to be. But I find them fascinating because they are going to, and in fact, they are appealing to an interesting electorate who will find resonance with their ideas. They will subsequently gain power. And you know what Siseko H says? Siseko H says there is no genocide without poetry. And damn it, what they're doing is quite poetic. And so we've got to be, this is why I'm saying it poses a problem. And it will, you know, there's one cat who really did a great project of the Rwandan genocide in terms of its analysis, and that's Mahmoud Mamdani. I have subsequently over the years disagreed with him on his other analyses. He just recently released Neither Settler Nor Native. But when victims become killers, he really traces very systematically what happened in the Rwandan genocide context, very, very systematically, thinking about the social engineered way in which that genocide took root and then took place. And what we will then say is when the genocide happens, I'm not saying that there actually is going to be a genocide. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that if we do not pay attention to Ubuqaba ontology, what will happen is that we'll fall back on these nonsensical claims of ethno-nationalism and misread the problem. And what I'm suggesting is a proactive analysis that seeks to suggest that we might maybe wish to abrogate even the poeticism leading to genocide. Okay, I'm going to now sort of wrap up. So the politics then of epistemic practice which give rise to ethical considerations are described by Fricker as injustices which harm the speaker, and I quote, in their capacity as a knower, and are termed testimonial injustices. And we all know this, right? Now, I don't want to do that because it's just going to take too much time. I want to sort of get to like the real point. In the case of a culpable epistemic injustice committed against a knowledge system in the South African context, I propose an analysis of the colonial consequences and the colonized subjects. At this juncture, I elect to root my analysis in a decolonial praxis, which compels me to use Mqhayi, which will reveal in substantive detail the sociality of epistemic practices. And here I appeal to Mqhayi's preface in Iyalamawele. He says, kweli balana ndizama ukubonisa imigudu nexesha elithatyathwayo ngamaXhosa xa elandela umthetho kuba kaloku kuzanyelwa ukuba uzekelwe kwisibakala esakhe sakho. Ndizama nokubonisa ukuba inkosi ayisinguyena umgqibi wezinto yedwa, njengoko izizwe ziba zona kunjalo kuthi. And then here's a point that I really like that he makes right at the end. He says, intetho nemikhwa yesiXhosa iyatshona ngokutshona ngenxa yelizwi nokhanyo olukhoyo oluze nezizwe zasentshonalanga. Right? Suggesting that our epistemic practices, our knowledge frameworks are being surpassed by the written word. What does His Excellency, former president, say when Zuma leaves? He says, thank God certain elements are leaving the African National Congress. What does Gqoba say at the conclusion of his Lovedale literary address? He says, may the day soon come when we natives of this land shall have altogether been healed from heathenism, and like our benighted countrymen who sacrificed everything in Christ's sake, do the same. I forget now how the concluding concepts go. But there's this idea of valorizing a liberal conception of the political domain of our country. And I seek to suggest that in this moment, when you go back to Indigeneity, which was published in 1937 by S.E.K. Mqhayi himself, when you go back to Indigeneity, he says that, you know, I pose the question, I think, in critical philosophy of race, when I ask, can Gqoba possess ontological legitimacy? I'm concluding, I promise, this is the last thought. He says, Gqoba can possess ontological legitimacy only insofar as they are aware of their historical background and their historical traditions. And this was in 1937. And that moment is coming up in South Africa. A lot of us are appealing to historical knowledges that we thought had been buried and that had died. And I'm really excited to see what will happen as a result of the resurrection of the Lovedale Press. But that particular resurrection of that knowledge, I think, has implications and bearings for how we shape the political domain of this country going forward. Now, my good colleague, Professor Nyoni, is now going to come up and tell you all that I've just been speaking absolute nonsense for the past 45 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Siseko, or Professor Kumalo, Dr. Professor Kumalo. Wow, okay, I think let's maybe just give one more round of applause for your presentation. I think you're probably all sitting there wondering what is a fine artist going to say after all of that? Truth be told, I'm not sure. But I have picked up on a couple of things that I'm going to use as prompts for discussion. My role here is not to give you a second lecture, but really to kind of unpack a couple of thoughts that came to mind as I was sitting there, and to throw some elements of provocation out to the crowd, to Siseko as well, in terms of where I think we find ourselves in South Africa, which is a very, very complex situation at this point in time. So maybe to start with, I think I'd like to, say our disciplines are not too far removed. I mean, I worked with Prof. Hurst within the space of philosophy for my own doctoral studies. And I think there was a point at which I asked, but what do I know about philosophy? And her wise response was, well, everything is philosophy. And I think that everything is philosophy. So being an artist, being a mathematician, being a whatever you are in the production of thought matter, you are creating philosophy. So I'd like to perhaps start by referencing, in your title, you use the word freedom. And that for me is important. I know there's a lot of conversation around Ubuntu these days, but I like to use the word uhuru, which is freedom. And I'm referring here to Ben Okri's text, A Way of Being Free. And I'd just like to read, if I may. Writers are the dream mechanisms of the human race. Narrative affects us the ways dreams affect us. They share the same insubstantiality. They both have the hidden capacity to alter reality. Dreams may be freer because they are not composed of words, but when narrative fiction has entered us, it no longer exists as words either. We can control our novels and our narratives to some extent. We cannot control the effect they might have on the world. We cannot wholly control our dreams. Sometimes at night we dream blasphemous and scandalous things. We dream murders and transformations. We sometimes even dream ourselves into our deepest truths and our unlikely desires. When we die in life, it is much easier to watch others dying too. It is much easier to murder the dreams of others, to poison the stream of their lives, to poison their innocence and their love. When we are dead in life, we don't notice when little miracles die around us before our deadened gaze. There are many ways to die, and not all of them have to do with extinction. A lot of them have to do with living many lies, living without asking questions, living in the cave of your own prejudices, living the life imposed on you, the dreams and codes of your ancestors. That's Ben Okri. And I think as you were speaking, I was struck by those words, partly because of the inclusion of the concept of freedom and where we find ourselves in South Africa. For some of you who may know, I'm a foreign national. So of course, my studies were in diasporic subjectivity, and the concept of freedom, individual and communal, speaks a lot to the content of what you're talking about in that political framework. So I want to sort of throw the question out to Siseko and to the group, and our Zoom viewers at home. In terms of freedom, how we postulate it, how we convey it, how we dream about it, how we think about it in terms of the politics of center and other, and how we dream of a particular type of freedom and what type of freedom we might be ascribing for. We've already spoken to this process of decoloniality. And I think, Siseko, you mentioned the idea of the institution or the structure of knowledge. And I want to just recount a particular instance, or a moment of reflection, let me say. If I had to tell you that I would be able to, if time travel were possible, I'd be able to walk into Rembrandt van Rijn. I don't know if you are familiar with the artist, the European artist Rembrandt's work. I'd be able to walk into his studio were it to be constructed or present in any moment in time. He's a very famous Dutch artist, died very poor. know many, but he made very beautiful paintings. And he was a printmaker too. I could, at this point in time, walk into his environment way back, hundreds of years ago, and make work like he did, using his techniques, using his materials, using everything. Why? Because I've been trained in those processes. Okay, so epistemically, his knowledge is my knowledge. Ontologically, what I do with that knowledge is a different story. So I would question, I would like that sort of space of like where the university, in terms of how we construct our knowledge frameworks, how we think about what we're learning, and the responsibility of the institution to individual freedoms as well as communal freedoms and so forth. I'd also like to question, maybe, or raise issues of matters of authenticity, particularly in relation to Ubuqaba. You know, to what extent does the space of authenticity arise in its many forms in the use of the epistemic ontology of Ubuqaba, right? How is it performed within various communities? How is it realized? How is it accented? How is it echoed? And how is it empowered? I don't necessarily, I mean, you mentioned the derision of things, and I think that is important because I want to refer, but sorry, Andrea's very used to me doing this. I speak in circles, but I'm going to come back to that, partly because in terms of the role that we have as educators, and then this is a struggle that I have at this point in time, and I'm coming back to that printmaking story. There was a reason why I told you this. If I were to tell you now that I am still teaching printmaking, but I don't teach it in the way that Rembrandt would appreciate today, I can still teach Rembrandt's processes in exactly the same way, but I might not need to because context has changed, knowledge has changed. Students don't arrive on my doorstep as empty vessels. So that for me is an interesting space of reflection on Ubuqaba. Is it something that sits outside of a space, or is it something that one needs to acknowledge as a process of being aware of the knowledge that exists in people as they arrive in a structure like a university, and therefore becomes a dialogue rather than a polemic? I'm interested in this idea of we live two lives, and I did watch a video of yourself, and yes, I did I stalked you. You mentioned at some point, and this is a particular question that I'd like to raise, is the issue of this. You vehemently contested the idea of ethno-nationalism, and I found that interesting. Particularly in reflection on diasporic subjectivities within the South African context, and the very complex idea of where people's movement knowledge areas come from and so forth, and maybe even the rhetoric of Pan-Africanist thought in relation to Uhuru. And I think you used a term in one of your talks, which is the native of nowhere, right? And I'd like for you to unpack that at some point. Okay, then I've got lots of writing here, but I'm not going to get into that just yet. But I've opened some thoughts, some sort of brain. I'm hoping I've thrown enough seeds out there for some questions to be asked of Siseko. I'm also happy to engage with conversation. And for our Zoom viewers at home, if there are questions on the chat, we are able to take audible requests as well if you'd like to have your voice heard, or we will take chat questions. But at this point in time, I'm quite happy to sit back and allow the floor to speak. If there's comments, we'll take maybe 5. I'll field the questions and then we'll respond and then take another 5 as we go along. But thank you very much for your presentation, Siseko. Do we have another roving mic perhaps that we could? Are there any questions? Would anyone like to perhaps even comments, reflections? Okay, we've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you will need a mic, I think, yes. So we've got one over here.
Thank you.
And could we
you.
maybe just introduce yourselves as well as you when you do speak? Oyama, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Mqhayi. I am a master's student with the Department of Conflict Management and Transformation. Almost forgot my department. I'm going to ask this question because my study is on leadership principles that come from Xhosa and focusing on conflict resolution. And I have a lot of questions and I don't want to take up time. I have 4 in particular. But maybe I should start with the last one about Ubuqaba. According to your definition, what is Gqoba? Is it the sum of all natives within South African boundary minus mission educated Victorian gentlemen? And because you use Gqoba, Mqhayi to critique philosophy and the current body politics of the country. And where do you classify them? Are they Ubuqaba or not? Can Gqoba evolve from being Gqoba into something else? Is Zuma a constant Gqoba, even though he spent most of his life with the same people that now critique him or oppose him, like Mbeki? Does it remain a perpetual Gqoba? So that's just maybe that question. What is a Gqoba? Does it evolve, and what evolves a Gqoba into something else? Thank you.
Thank you, Olwam. We have another question. There's 2 on this side. There's one over here. Young gentleman over here. And just behind me.
All right, hello everyone. You're speaking to Mqhayi Hodiso. I'm an undergraduate BA majoring in politics. You mentioned something about, I'll put it in say constructivism,
Constructivism, yeah.
constructivism, which I think I connected it to the dot of say epithets. You say, yeah, the words.
Yeah, the words, eh?
The words. But when you spoke about that, it brought me to this assignment I'm even busy with. I have to submit it on the 24th.
I'm not going to help you with that.
But you're going to give me a light on the context of the subject.
Okay.
Say, everyone has his own philosophy, as you said. And the question was, on the assignment was, how do we relate that to the international systems? Okay, yeah. So how do we relate it to the international system? I've already translated it to say the relations, because it is what I have that will make me be able to interpret the realities of what is. So I was thinking if we can dive into this
Epistemology, yeah.
I think I found the similarity between the constructivism perspective and that part. So if you dive into an explanation of this keyword for me, so that I can understand it better, I think it will be very useful for me.
Constructivism.
Thanks. Nah, the
Epistemology.
Yes.
I'm going to let Siseko do that for you.
Thanks.
Okay.
I think for me it would be a comment, but maybe after, because I think a gentleman over there raised something I was thinking about.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Gqoba. I am from here teaching ceramics at the Fine Arts faculty. So I think I'll wait for a response in terms of Gqoba, and then I would like to have a comment after that.
Professor Kumalo, I see you. And I thank you very, very much. Look, we obviously, think of ourselves as positioned, right? Almost always when we start, we think of ourselves as positioned, right? In fact, I think had I not thought of myself as positioned, I perhaps would not have done philosophy, right? I'm doing philosophy because I'm thinking of myself as positioned. One of the key questions there, of course, is whether other people are positioned, right? Also asking whether, in fact, are there other positions, right? And this is a question that arises from the fact that I am positioned, right? So there's a lot of questions there that I'm dealing with at that point, right? Where interacting with other positions, interacting with others, I'm wondering if there are other positions and whether, as I'm struggling with those positions and I seem to move from my own position, is this legitimate? Am I moving to a new position? Is there another position that has now made me move to another position? Am I hallucinating? Right? I'm struggling with all of this, right? So obviously now I'm trying to find ways, right, to think not only about other people's positionalities and other positions, but I'm also to think about my own, right? I'm struggling with that. And it seems to me legitimate then to articulate my own position, to almost always be thinking about my own position and how to articulate my own position, right? Such that even when there are other positions, those positions take note of my own position, right? I'm not always simply looking for other positions, simply asking where should I be positioned, right? It seems to me a legitimate position for me to say, I am located here and here is my location, right? And articulated that position, right? So when I seek clarity in the kind of thing that people, for example, talk of as pure philosophy, right? I'm not perhaps almost always looking for, I'm not running away from positionality, right? Nor am I running away from being located, right? It is perhaps because I'm taking serious the notion that I am positioned, right? And wondering if I am positioned nowhere, and wondering if that it is not an option for me, right? Exactly because I think, and I'm struggling with the fact that I am positioned, there are other positions, they move me, I interact with them, right? And it does not, I'm not sure, but I did not quite hear you struggling with that. All right.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question, I think, from someone on Zoom.
So we have a question from Tandalwetu Langa. Does the use of the title His Excellency former President Thabo Mbeki as compared to former President Jacob Zuma, is this a distinction between Mbeki, Gqoba, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation, and Zuma, Mqhayi? So that's one question, and then we have a second.
Let's stop there. I think there's quite a few that we might be able to answer. We'll pick up on you first as we come. Starting with Olam's question, how your definition of Ubuqaba, and then we'll move to the other ones. You've got it all there. Can I just add to your question? The one thing that perhaps was for me a little. You touched on it at some point, and maybe you can leave it to sort of percolate in your mind. The gendered space of Ubuqaba. To what extent, I mean, is that present in your politicization or epistemic or the ontology of such? Because to be honest, you spoke about men, and that's it. So I'll leave that for a little later.
It's a bit unfair, that last question. it's a little bit unfair, but okay. And I say that, I want to start just with the last question that we got on Zoom, because I know where that question is going, and I know the cat who raised that question. And I suppose it's a Freudian slip on my part. That's all. It's not to make that particular distinction. Maybe I should think about it. And I am very happy that it has been raised in that way, because it does indicate a very interesting internal conversation that's happening in my mind, right?
And the person who asked that question knows exactly my position on Mbeki and his I am an African, which I absolutely adore. And as we know, that was the acceptance speech of the Constitution, Democratic Constitution in 1996. Mbeki made the profound claim when he says, I am an African. And yeah, we'll leave it at that, Langa. We will continue the conversation offline. Thank you very much for that. On the question of what is Gqoba, I've treated this question quite interestingly in Theoria, and then I went on to critical philosophy of race, right? Thinking precisely about that question of how do we define this category of Gqoba? Does it change? Does it not? Do I understand blackness to be denotative of Ubuqaba? In my scholarship, I make a distinction between two camps. I make a distinction between Amaqaba and Amaqoboga. Amaqoboga, of course, missionary educated, and take on a very pejorative position toward Amaqaba. Is Jacob Zuma Gqoba? Does he slip? Does he change? Does he... the simplest answer, without getting into another lecture, the simplest answer would be, it's nice, it's convenient for me to locate him in the camp of Gqoba. It's very convenient. But there are complications with that convenience. Complications that come from Mbongi's question of being positioned, positionality, and negotiating one's position in relation to others. But I think the long and short of it, and I would be very happy to sort of pick up the conversation because it is an extensive one. I've been working in this area now, I think, for the last 5 years. Set aside the fact that I'm only beginning to sort of come out into the public with this material now, but I've been working on it for the last 5, even 6 years. The first articulation of this came out as defining an African vocabulary, and I was thinking alongside Louis Nkosi, J.M. Coetzee, Nadine Gordema on the question of white writing, right? And Louis Nkosi reviews these two texts. I believe it was in 1989, and he comes to the conclusion, or was it 87? I'm not sure, but he comes to the conclusion that what Nadine Gordema in The Essential Gesture and what J.M. Coetzee give us in White Writing on the Culture of Letters in South Africa is the necessity to invent an African vocabulary. Where there is no distinction between the signified and the signifier. What does that mean? That's a very bold claim in a philosophical space to say that there's no distinction between the signifier and the signified. That's a very deep question in philosophy of language. But what I think he's trying to get at is to say that, and he even calls it, and J.M. Coetzee calls it in White Writing, the necessity for the invention of an Adamic language, where the landscape speaks with its own vocabulary. And what we have at the moment is this kind of dislodging of the vocabulary of the landscape. And so to answer the question, as I said, I think we might have to take it offline, but I've attempted to treat this question over the years, thinking with the notion of an African vocabulary, then pointedly coming to the derision that Amaqaba face. And I'm not the only one, by the way, who has this conversation. Zeksim does, Heart of Redness thinks about this question quite systematically. A.C. Jordan thinks about this question in Ngomboye Minyanya. So there have been a number of iterations of what does it mean to be in the institution, especially in the context of Kwano College, where I'm now exiting. The University of Fort Hare and its role and place in educating the children of the Black elite, what becomes the Black elite in the introduction of a Euro-modern, Euro-Western economy. Right. So I hope that it doesn't answer your question, I know, but I would like us to pursue it further because it's a bit more complex than just one response on question and answer session. To answer the young man who's writing a paper, I would suggest that you go to Alistair McIntyre's Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and you think with him in that paper of his on tradition and translation, or that chapter of his on tradition and translation, in this idea of international relations and whether each particular country has its own particular conception, because it really boils down to what are the cultural, what's the language from which you speak. And often really, or not often, but in that analysis that Mqhayi gives us of tradition and translation, is that he talks about the differences of translations. He goes to the question of commensurability, right? Whether or not there's commensurability between different traditions. So for example, can China speak to Russia? Can Russia speak to the West? Because of the traditional, because of their traditions, their cultures, etc., etc. So I would suggest Alistair McIntyre, who's Justice with Rationality, specifically the chapter on tradition and translation in answering your paper. Mm. And then, Mbongisi, wonderful to see you to begin with. I'm very, very grateful for your company today. I didn't grapple with this question because I actually had not figured it, right? And I love the way that you put it as an issue of positionality, because indeed, if we go to the example that I'm using of Justice Theron and Mqhayi, both are positioned. And both of them are positioned with incredible political power in their various spaces. You've got a sitting justice of the Constitutional Court, and you've got Mqhayi ohola ibutho likaZulu, right? And he even says, when umntwana says to him, you can't do that, he says, number one, awukakasigcobi isilo, asikakabekwa isilo, mina ngiphethe ibutho likaZulu engalishiyelwa isilo, right? So he responds back and he says to the Prime Minister, you have no authority over me. The king would have authority over me. Sibekwe isilo, the current reigning king. And what happens? Mqhayi very, very quietly goes and he joins isilo sikandaba unangjana uzwelithini, right? Because it's a different dynamic. And he always says, mina ngalishiyelwa isilo ibutho likaZulu, right? So both of them are very strategically positioned in very key positions of power in the context of where they are located in society. And I don't grapple with that question because, unfortunately, it had not occurred to me. So I really appreciate the complication that you bring, because it demonstrates precisely that question of, when we're thinking about legitimacy and registers of legitimacy, that legitimacy necessarily speaks to the location, be it to power, be it to resources, be it to, it speaks to where one is positioned. And Mqhayi necessarily negotiates his positionality and his location to the constitution, resulting in his kind of response to say, I'm going to Nkandla, whether folks like it or not. And he's not going there on a position of violence, right? And on this question of positionality, in fact, I actually gave another public lecture at the University of Johannesburg titled, There is no African Epistemology, Only Just a Universal Epistemology, attempting to demonstrate the problems that come with the relegations of certain ways of knowing to particular categories and their ghettoization. Right? So in the claim, there is no African epistemology, somebody is there trying to position themselves in a particular kind of way to say that there is there's more legitimacy to claims that they're making from a universal position as opposed to a located position that could be sort of quote unquote African philosophy kind of thing. So I really appreciate the question because it demonstrates, I think, something that might have to feature in here. I'll footnote you, and we've got video of it, so you can be like, Kumalo, you didn't footnote me, and then you can take me to court. I lie. But I trust that sort of attempts to some of the questions. On the native of nowhere, let's chat about that. Again, it's complex, right? I speak to the question of objection in critical studies in teaching and learning in 2018, this objection which results in the creation of the native of nowhere. And in conversation then, again, this is something that I think is quite fascinating in terms of this particular project that I'm working on this paper, of what does that mean in relation to this native of nowhere? What does it mean in relation to indigeneity asserting itself in the political domain, or indigenous being asserting itself in the political domain of South Africa as situated, quote unquote, situated natives. I'm not sure what that means. I'd have to test it, in my schema of analysis to be like, what does that do for this kind of work that we're trying to do here? And when does Blackness become unsituated in the schema of South Africa, and why does it become unsituated? And how does its situated or unsituatedness relate to the question of African subjectivities that are, quote unquote, outside of this project that we call South Africa as a result of the borders inaugurated by colonial incursion? So I think it's a powerful question that I think needs further testing, so I don't want to do it injustice.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have another question coming from an online space. And then we also had Muzi, who was going to follow up after your definition of Ubuqaba from Ulam's question. Ulam's got another follow-up as well. So let's take the Zoom. Zwandile, Ulam, and then put Kamala. Samson, okay. How many questions do we have there on Zoom, Erin?
I believe it's 2.
Okay, let's just take those quickly. I think we're doing okay for time. I think maybe another... This round could be it? Okay, right. And so we'll take this round of questions and then we'll do a wrap up. You still haven't addressed my gender idea, but it's fine. We'll get there.
It's an unfair question.
No, we're going to get there.
As we're getting those, could we maybe take the ones in the room?
Yeah, sure, of course. Let's take the ones in the room at the moment until we get the Zoom questions. Muzi, do you want to follow up before Muzi adds his coda to your question, or is it a?
No, I was not going to follow up.
Okay, it's a new question altogether. Okay,
Okay.
Muzi.
Thank you for your provocation. So as you were talking, addressing this issue of Ubuqaba, the song that came in mind was Fela Kuti, where when he says, I'm not a gentleman at all. I'm an African original. So Fela Kuti is a musician that studied abroad, but then he came back and created Afrobeat. So in a way, I feel that Ubuqaba has to do with a sense of being, like a craving of being, a sense of resisting or resistance. When we're looking at it from oral literature or from oral archives, it comes from Ukunqaba, Amanqaba, when it comes to isiZulu and other sources. Amanqaba, people who were resisting. They were resisting to be something else now than what they are, in terms of what they know themselves as. They have their own cultures, they have their own customs, they have their own philosophies. So they want to be themselves, or maybe to be able to choose how they would like to be impacted or influenced by other people. So in my thinking, as we were talking, I know that in its Xhosa context is different, but somehow there is a relation in a way, if maybe it has to speak of Imbola, yes, Imbola. So the smears of red ochre, but still in that sense that that's their way of life and they don't want to be disturbed in their way of life. So then, because in South Africa, we haven't really addressed the issue of psychological reparations. So these issues, they always tend to sip underneath because it was simply just bandaged over and not like addressed. So it turns out to come up, but some people become opportunists because of that. Because now, when you are a being, especially maybe in the African context, or maybe I'll say for an example in the Zulu context, you'll find that you exist as a society. So as you mentioned a bit about Jacob Zuma is there in the political space, but at the same time is part of the being, the Zulu people, is part of the community. For instance, when Mangosuthu Buthelezi passed on, he was the only one remaining from the other politicians in his funeral. He was the last one who was there until the end. So in that sense, then there's that connectedness that is there with him and the people around, especially those who identify themselves as the Zulu people. So now when it's also, there's some other rituals happening and he's there taking part, he's taking off his ties and suits, and then he's dressed in the traditional regalia and he's dancing with them. He becomes part of them. So in that sense, he reinforces this stubbornness, Oguti, as something that is there, a sense of being that shouldn't become lost because maybe of other outside influences. That could be education, perhaps. So it becomes tricky in that part in terms of where he falls. So I think it's something, is a term that kind of shifts. When I was growing up in the early 90s, also we had a Mqhabane in ANC. Amaqabane, they were more like some young freedom fighters who were kind of like resisting, but they're kind of more violent in a way. So I think there's a shift, in terms of this term of Gqoba. It's not just a fixed. So people can choose when they believe to be Gqoba, or maybe when they want to be, identified as elsewhere. Even Mqhayi himself that you mentioned of, he had a black belt. He did karate. It's a Japanese, it's a Japanese martial arts. But when he's there, he's dressed, in his traditional way, and then he's standing there and he's stating the laws of the community that even Mangosuthu Buthelezi have to abide by because he understands them well, that he can't tell him anything. Yeah, so that's my thinking along the point.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great example. Thank you. I love that sense of, I think it was Olwan. I love that sense of transformation or transformative qualities of identity. And I think that's, it's obviously not what you're trying to do is create a sort of polemic around inside, outside, periphery, mainstream sort of space. But I think what Moses just touched on is something very close to my heart, which is that there is this agency embedded within that positionality that which Mongisa was talking about, which I think is really important to consider. I'm giving you another little corner kick here. Why do you fascinate about Zuma as your example, though?
I'll tell you.
Okay.
I'll tell you. Very exciting.
Perhaps he could also look at King Dalingebo, who himself, operating from Gqoba, positionality against a Zuma, who's the president. And now, how do you classify that? But that was not my question.
I know.
And then, truly, thank you for this work. It truly helps us to think, through even our own work. I can't thank you enough for this. So the next question is really about how people move in and out of this colonial framework in the legal space, in education, in medicine, culture, and religion, and all of that. And people are withdrawing themselves from that Western way of being. And I'm saying this because there's a sense of that we have been coerced into accepting and taking, the democratic dispensation and principles without understanding it. And it talks about how I feel nervous when I have to raise my view in this context. It talks about how we consistently feel foreign when you go to the court of law to plead our case, and we don't know anything what's happening without the mediation of lawyers and judges with laws we know nothing about, as opposed to Icala Lamawele, where a king sits and speaks in your language, uses the laws that you know very well, even with their consequences, and what they bring, what they tell you, as you are the complainant, you know what, asifuni ukunona nobabini up. We don't want to sin against the both of you. And the judgment should be such that you are more confident of the space and of yourself, the surety of who you are in this household, in this nation under this king and judge. And people are feeling that we have to forever, my point, my question was really about the sense of being coerced into the Roman Dutch law raised by the MK and many others before, as opposed to, for us, a traditional sense of law and order being used in order to reprimand and correct us. What is your reflection on that?
Can I take the
Yeah, there was a.
Zooms, and then we come back?
Okay, 2 Zooms already? Okay.
From Dr. Q, we have beautiful lecture. Well done, Dr. Kumalo. I have had the privilege to be in one of your lectures on Ubuqaba at the Wits University. To dwell a bit on the term Ubuqaba, what does it mean, and is it really a premise of freedom?
Yeah, people are really drilling you for a definition, guys. Yeah. Okay.
Then
Second one?
Second one from Tabang Ishmael. By the Mqhayi, I apologize again, makes conflict within the society, like Malema and Zuma. White people see them as a threat, I think it's trying to say, because they say it will lead to genocide, like figures like Elon Musk. And if we use that approach, we will be sanctioned. And looking at the Steve Biko ideology, that Idi Amin of Uganda, I'm not too sure if that's
Yeah, that's quite a
clear.
radical question, what at least is that time?
I sort of figure where it's going.
You got where it's going.
I did.
Okay, that's fine. Let's take the ones in the room.
And then we've got
Samson.
Samson.
Some sort.
Wasn't Samson's power in his hair?
Yes.
In the Bible?
Yeah. Then Delilah.
Samson, do you have locks? Do you have locks? Hair? Do you have
No, I just have hair.
So no.
hair? So you do have power. Let's hear the question.
Okay. Mina, my question is like, how do you define Ubuqaba in an Afrocentric mindset or Eurocentric mindset? That's the first. Yes, I want you to specify. Also, if we define Ubuqaba in a Eurocentric mindset, do we have Europeans who regard them as Amaqaba?
Yep.
Going to KZN, in KZN, that's the most provinces we regard as Amaqaba most of the time. You made Uzuma your example. Uzuma is an institution in KZN. If you're against Uzuma, you lost KZN. If you are against Zulu Kingdom, you lost KZN. If you are against the church that is regarded the Church of Amaqaba, the Shembe Church, you lost KZN. So, how do you exactly define Ubuqaba? Is it Eurocentric or Afrocentric mindset? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that kind of speaks to that specificity of your
the
example
definition.
of why the definition and also the use of Zuma, who is an institution, as Samson has just said, in himself. Speaking to the sense of the individual's identity as defined becomes the communal spirit. And I think that is something that Samson is also trying to say.
So I'll start with Samson's question via Vulindlela.
You're still forgetting the gender question.
Stop it. Why Zuma? I'm attracted to the figure of Jacob Zuma as my point of analysis because he's an anomaly, like a genuine anomaly. That's also just theoretically very beautiful. It is puzzling, and it is a deep source of theory. Like, he is the well that does not stop giving. because of it. He's the only president who assumes the presidency of South Africa in the democratic era and has his tempo. And the nation acquiesces to the fact that the president has his tempo. And every other inauguration, there's a different Konuma Kumalo, Konuma Ntuli, Konuma, and we are happy with it as a nation. We are. And yes, there are people who are critiquing him, the coffers, taxpayers, bloated household, in. But he doesn't give a damn for that. He doesn't. Whether we like it, whether we don't, he doesn't give a damn of the criticisms that are leveled against him. And so I'm curious about, shucks, this cat. It's a really nice cat. It's the first thing. Because he challenges the institution of the presidency in a democratic era in a multicultural society like South Africa. And he shows up as his native self, unapologetic. And I love that. I do. Because it says to us, what does it mean for us to have a liberal democratic framework in a multicultural society, where liberalism attempts to coerce us into its frameworks, which is one of the reasons why my scholarship has attempted to sort of think about a post-liberal conception of democracy on the African continent. So it's not to say that I'm against democracy. No. I want democracy, but as you have a social democracy in Germany, a monarchical democracy in the United Kingdom, and a liberal democracy in the United States, I want something that speaks to our context, where democracy on the African continent does not have to be an American democratic conception in order for it to be legible to the world. And Uzuma does that. Uzuma says, I am not going to acquiesce to a liberal conception of democracy in order to be legible to the world. And I like that. Is it challenging? It is, because it often kind of oscillates with what we know to be quote unquote a democratic. But okay, there are different hats that one can wear in different spaces. And there are institutions, spoken or unspoken, that one has to abide by and oblige if one will exist legitimately in the space of KwaZulu-Natal. Because you're right. The moment you go against Uzuma, or you critique Isilo, you know what I mean? Like there's certain things in KZN, and KZN doesn't become KZN out of nowhere. It becomes KZN because of Ubuthelezi, Usheng under apartheid as the quote-unquote whatever minister, the first minister of the Natal, collaborates quite extensively with the monarchy to create this formidable institution. KZN is the only province in the country where the opening of the provincial legislation, Isilo takes the head as the head of the, and the premier takes on a prime ministerial. It's a beautiful thing. It's gorgeous to watch and behold, I think. It really is. So this is the reason why I'm interested in Jacob, the good, His Excellency former President Jacob Zuma.
First name terms.
And this, to answer the question then of do I take an Afrocentric or Eurocentric, I think it's Afrocentric. I'm interested in a post-liberal conception of democracy that facilitates an endogenous articulation of democracy to our context. And it's going to be unsettling, it's going to be painful, because it means thinking outside of the box in order to define those parameters. On the definition, I think it was Dr. Gqoba who asked that question. He's here at the University of Nelson Mandela University, and I don't know why he's not in the room. Because Zani, if you're still watching, I see you. To go back to this definition so when I presented this work, by the way, at Huntsville in Alabama, University of Alabama, Huntsville, a couple of moons ago, 2023, I presented on Ash Wednesday, actually, in 2023, I remember, like yesterday. One of my good colleagues asks a good question of saying, and it's sort of similar to what Samson is saying, is it Afrocentric, is it Eurocentric? But he asks it in the question of, there is the ontology of Ubuqaba and there's an ontologization of Ubuqaba, which is what happens in the tradition of Euro-Western philosophies, who sort of create what Mudimbe then calls the African as retarded, gradual, and backward in the assessment of the African when colonialism invents Africa, right? So there's an ontologization process that fixes blackness to this retarded, backward, unchanging, fixed sort of thing. Mahmoud Mamdani also sort of traces that argument in terms of how it happens. And my colleague invited me to do this work of distinguishing how my project sort of guards against this ontologization, even as I account for this ontological exposition, right? So as I'm doing this ontological work, how am I not falling into those traps of ontologizing, fixing blackness into this pre-logic, historic, retarded, gradual type of thing? And I haven't done that project, which I think I must do, because I think it will answer a lot of the questions of how the hell do I define this concept of Ubuqaba. I think it really will. And then to move on to the question of how do I move, how do I see us moving in and out of, and I love the question that, I love the fact that you use the legal framework, Puti. You know, for a very long time, I used to disagree with the good commissioner, Tsepo Mahlingozi. And I would often be like, Tsepo, you know, I don't like your stuff. He's a good friend, very good friend, but I didn't like his stuff because it was very, I found him to be critical of the constitutional framework of South Africa until I think it was this year, Human Rights Day. And I'm thinking to myself, and I was watching the news, and it was the Senzo Meyiwa case. And in the Senzo Meyiwa case, there's an interpreter there who is a translator, interpreter, sort of cat. And it's Human Rights Day. And I really had a thought. I was like, we have 12 official languages in South Africa, but the language of the law is English, Dutch, and Latin. So if you think about the concepts that we have in the law, in the legal frameworks of our country, these are the languages that come up, right? And I was like, shucks, eh? Tsepo identified this a very, very long time ago. And he, and Commissioner Mahlingozi, apologies. You know, we must use people's titles. Andrea today, Professor Hurst showed me today that we've got to use the right titles. So he identifies this quite nicely, systematically, as far back as I think the early 2000s already, when he becomes disillusioned with how the Constitution and the law treats blackness. And he's not one saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but he's asking for this alignment, right, between the law, the ontology of the people that the law is supposed to govern, and the political framework of the country. And he really sums this up quite nicely in conversation with Sizwe Mpofu Walsh the other day on that episode that they did together on Sizwe's podcast, where he sort of really thinks seriously about this. And as a result, he converts me to the project that he's looking at, which is to say there's a mismatch between the legal systems that are supposed to govern the people, and the political framework of the country. There's a mismatch that's happening there. And I don't want to say let's go back to the framework of the legal systems of Olanduka or Mqhayi. For example, S.E.K. Mqhayi accounts a story here of a case arbitrated in Mqhayi's court of a white man having had sort of put a case against a slave, and before Mqhayi arbitrates the case, he says, here in Xhosa land, we do not have the thing as a slave, and so we will treat this issue as an issue of two men who have had a disagreement. And the issue is treated, and you do not know things of modernity, and because you do not know things of modernity, when I'm at Roma, I am going to lay a charge against you with Colonel Somerset. And so there are things I think that in our legal frameworks are useful, but the problem is that we've lost some of those concepts and the way that law is supposed to work. Going to the gender question, often nowadays, because of oracy, orality, and orature, and our codes or our legal frameworks being sort of encoded in in orality, the way that they are often resurrected is in ways that favors a patriarchal conception of society, which comes with a colonial conception of fixing the African in gradual, retarded, and backward ways of thinking. So one has to sort of do a double bind when reading our legal frameworks of reading against the grain to say what speaks in this Adamic language that Louis Nkosi is after, without these inventions that would seek to oppress particular individuals while sort of establishing hegemony and dominance for other individuals in society. So in terms of how I think of this, how we are, I do think it's a coercion. I really do think it's a coercion. For the fact that Gqoba does the natives' customs, their laws, and their beliefs in 1885, or is it 1886? And then 1895, you have the promulgation of the Witchcraft Suppression Act in South Africa, which is not resisted by Black intellectuals in this country, says something. It says something about the project of coercing Black folk, Mqhayi, into this political economy of liberalism. Yeah. Let me stop.
Yeah,
I think it's a lot.
There's a lot going on. I think we're going to get to the end of things. I mean, we could go on for hours and days and all the rest of it. As you were just making that last point, I was just thinking about the context. I happen to have a student who's present at this moment in time. He's going to be submitting. He's working on, the phenomenon of black tax as a case for social cohesion. Or Ubuntu as a social cohesion. And part of me is starting to think, what role does Ubuqaba play in establishing, contributing, where's the performativity of the positives or the negatives or the realness of these things? As an artist, and I was just talking to Muzi, as an artist, we make things, we have a problem with fitting in something or understanding something, we write an opera or we get our hands in the clay. And I think it's the responsibility of those of us who are in institutions like this to, as you say, tackle the ontologies, tackle the epistemologies, to create, to think. But writers have even more of a responsibility than you think they do. And I just want to end here with a kind of sort of coda, hopefully that contextualizes everything we've been speaking about. And I'm going to turn back to Ben Okri, one of my favorite writers again. What hope is there for individual reality or authenticity when the forces of violence and orthodoxy, the earthly powers of guns and bombs and manipulated public opinion make it impossible for us to be authentic and fulfilled human beings? The only hope is in the creation of alternative values, alternative realities. The only hope is in daring to re-dream one's place in the world, a beautiful act of imagination and a sustained act of self-becoming, which is to say that in some way or other, we breach and confound the accepted frontiers of things. The other way is to undertake an integral migration, to become an exile within the interiors of the self. We accept, we change, in some way we go mad. We live two lives, we become two people. We dislocate, we implode. Then our secret selves become more real than our external selves. The best things are beyond words. The human race is not yet free. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope those of you who viewed from home enjoyed it as much as we did. And I'd like to thank Iscia. I'd like to thank our microphone runners, B, Danny, Erin, and Taryn, who are in the background, and our sound and audiovisual crew at the back there. Thank you very much for making things happen. And to all of you for attending. We hope that something like this will happen again. Siseko, once again, thank you. Cut. Was it a performance?